So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Pete Smith. Pete.
Thank you, Julia. I'll just share my screen. I'm going to be talking about approaches from the biosciences towards climate change mitigation. And climate change mitigation, if you don't know, is the sort of process whereby we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting so that we cause less climate change. We'll be talking about mitigation and adaptation tonight. So I'll start just by telling you how I ended up in this field. I trained in zoology and undergraduate PhD. I mainly apply research to address climate change, biodiversity loss, global food security, and delivery of ecosystem services from the land. So these are the areas that I'm particularly interested in. Ended up mathematical model. I ended on the sort of mathematical end of biology. So that's basically just saying that we use mathematical models or computer models to simulate the effects of climate change, to simulate greenhouse gas emissions from the land. So just an example of how we can use biology. I'll share a few slides to show you some work that I've been doing on using the land to help tackle climate change. The first one is looking at how to reach 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as outlined in the Paris Agreement. And Julia explained this in the introduction. Well, firstly, you can see that if we continue with business as usual, we end up in a terrible state. So our chances of keeping global temperatures below 2 or even 1.5 degrees Celsius are minimal. So we just can't continue with business as usual. What we need is what's shown in this green bar. We need conventional abatement technologies. So this is moving away from fossil fuels, a rapid decarbonisation of all sectors of the economy, so that we transfer to, for example, renewables, perhaps some nuclear, just things that don't emit CO2. But we need to ramp these up really rapidly, and this gets us down on this trajectory closer to 2 degrees. But it won't get us to 2 degrees because there are still some emitting technologies that are in the mix. Aviation is going to be difficult to decarbonise, and agriculture emits greenhouse gases, particularly nitrous oxide and methane, which are really powerful greenhouse gases. And it's very difficult to produce our food with agriculture without, I always say that biology is much more difficult than rocket science. Rocket science, you've just got a few parameters to play with, but with biology, it's much more complex. So given that we're going to have some emissions still in the mix, we wouldn't be able to get to 2 degrees Celsius unless we could somehow have some greenhouse gas removal or negative emissions. Now the land's really important here because when plants grow, they fix carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. And when they fix that carbon, they're taking it out of the atmosphere and they're including it in the biomass. And some of that carbon goes down into the soil, which is increasing the soil carbon pool. So this acts as a temporary or medium term store of carbon. So if we can increase the carbon sinks, the amount of carbon we've got in soil and vegetation, we can offset to a certain extent some of these emissions that are still going to be in the mix during this century. And that allows us to get to somewhere close to Celsius, but it's only really possible with some negative emissions, and those negative emissions can be provided by the land. So here are some examples of nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions that can move CO2 from the atmosphere. So firstly, we have our forests, which we can largely reforest areas that have been deforested in the past. We can avoid forest conversion. We can manage our forest better. We can improve plantations, avoid fjords, and we can have better fire management. And all of these together give us mitigation potentials up in the gigatons of CO2 gigatons of CO2 per year. We've also got options in our agricultural in the land, so we can, by using agroforestry, we can put trees into croplands. We can use biochar. We can improve our grazing land and nutrient management, and our cropland management, for example, with conservation agriculture, where we leave our residues on the soil and we reduce the intensity of the tillage. We can also improve land management to some extent to try and reduce methane emission. Things like wetlands and coastal peatlands, which can also provide carbon sinks, so we can reduce emissions, carbon emissions from these systems, and we can increase the carbon sinks, the amount of carbon that's being stored and locked up away from the atmosphere. When we look at the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, we realize that the land can have a very important contribution. So that to have a land sector that's compatible with a 1.5 degree world, we may really need to make some radical changes. So this is what the land sector contributes to that 1.5 target, quite a significant component of that target. We can break that down into these. This first pie chart shows the things that we need to do. We need to reduce deforestation and degradation, the conversion of mangroves, and stop our peatland burning. We need to reduce emissions from agriculture, and I'll come on to that in a moment. We need to shift to a plant-based diets. Livestock produce a huge amount of methane emissions. So if we shifted towards more plant-based diets and less animal products, meat and dairy, we could reduce the emissions from the food that we produce significantly. We can also reduce food waste. We can restore degraded forests and peatlands. We can improve forest management, and we can enhance soil carbon sequestration, as well as investing in R&D in other sources. So we need to do that quickly. We need to ramp these things up quickly. If we just look at the pathways to get there, this is the reduced deforestation, reduced emissions from agriculture, the shift in plant-based diets. We need to get up to a 50% adoption of plant-based diets for the whole global population by 2050, if we're to have any chance of hitting the 1.5 degrees target. Similarly, we have to reduce food waste. We currently waste about 30% of all the food that we grow on the planet. So we need to reduce that by at least 50% by 2050. In addition to restoring our degraded lands, to protecting our pristine systems, our peatlands and our tropical forests, as well as reducing emissions from agriculture. We need all of these things together if we're going to have a chance of getting to our 1.5 target. The land has a really important role to play in that. Additionally, we can look at how it contributes to these sustainable development goals. Climate, what we're talking about today, but that's just one of the sustainable development goals to combat climate change. That's sustainable 17 other sustainable development goals. We can take a given practice, for example, reforestation. We can look at the functions that provides. Reforestation provides, for example, carbon sequestration, production of food and fuels and fire, regulation of water quality, habitat for biodiversity, jobs and recreation. We can relate those functions to the ecosystem services that they provide. The ecosystem services that are provided by those functions are shown as the nature's contributions to people. That's just another way of saying ecosystem services. So these little green circles correspond to the functions that are provided by the forest, and they contribute to these ecosystem services. And as you can see, reforestation contributes positively to almost all of these ecosystem services. But we can then relate these ecosystem services to the Sustainable Development Goals. So what's shown in the outer ring of this pizza are the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and each of these little circles in the dark blue on the outside correspond to one of the ecosystem services. So the ecosystem services are supporting the delivery of these Sustainable Development Goals. So in this example, you can see that they're mostly positive. We get some variable impacts. For example, by reforesting an area, we could be competing with land that's used for food production. So that could cause problems for food security in some areas. And reduced deforestation could have some local negative impacts on economic growth, where that deforestation is supporting jobs. But these are few and far between, and we tend to get largely positive impacts on ecosystem services and on the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a whistle tour of some of the area to address the problem of climate change mitigation. So biology is a key discipline for addressing some of the world's greatest challenges. But the world's really complex, and just sitting in our silos, biologists, we wouldn't be able to address these things by ourselves. So we need to work with others. We need to work with, for example, economists, social scientists, political scientists, to work out how best to deliver mitigation from the land. The land and the food system have a vital role to play in climate change mitigation. It's a really important sector. It contributes about a quarter of the greenhouse gases, so we have to use it to help reduce those greenhouse gases. And whilst it's got an important role to play, it can't do it all. So for people who say that we could just suck up carbon by planting more trees, that's nonsense, because we need immediate and aggressive action in all sectors of the economy to reduce emissions to a level where the land can just suck up the remaining carbon. We can't do it all. We can't rely on the land. The good thing is that many options for climate change mitigation in the land use sector and in the food system deliver a range of co-benefits for ecosystem services and also the delivery of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they're also good for biodiversity. That's why sometimes they're called nature-based solutions. And if you're still working biologists, or if you're biology teachers, keep on doing what you're doing, because we need biology now more than ever, as we've seen in the COVID crisis. We need biology, and we need biology to be part of these multidisciplinary teams. So keep on doing biology, keep teaching biology. It's a really important role. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Pete Smith. That's fantastic. A couple of follow-up questions, if I may. The first really is around this plant-based diet that you were mentioning, and indeed that's a big part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's land report of 2019. I mean, how easy do you feel and likely do you feel it would be for a 50% adoption of this plant-based diet by 2050 on a global scale?
I think it's going to be extremely challenging. We know that even when people know that their health is affected by a poor diet, it's really difficult to get them to change. And there are so many socio-cultural that governments just can't tell people you must not eat meat. That's just not the work that's been done in Cambridge, which is excellent work, which just looks at if you put the meat at the end of the canteen, the queue in the canteen, by the time you get to the meat, you've already filled up your plate with vegetables. So people tend to take less meat or no meat to move people in the right direction. But it's not going to be easy, but it really is necessary to do so. The other thing I'll just say quickly is that it doesn't mean the lowest emissions diet is obviously a vegan diet, but not everybody has to become vegan to make a difference. For people who choose to continue eating meat and dairy, just eating smaller portion sizes or reducing the amount of meat you eat or take a free day contributes to the overall solution of the problem. So it could be done by showing greater restraint in countries that currently overconsume livestock products like ours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pete. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll leave the rest of the questions to right at the end of the three presentations. Thank you so much.